Hi there, Ford owners. Today in your 2016 Ford F-53 chassis motorhome, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install Roadmaster's Rear Anti-Sway Bar. Now before we install our components, we're going to go ahead and hit our test course to get a baseline on how our motorhome feels. We're going to start with the uneven bump section, which is going to simulate hitting a pothole. And right away, once we hit that first one, we get some rocking going back and forth there. So we can tell there's a little bit of slop. Ooh, it's pretty good rock just from one little bump there. You can really hear it in the back. There's a lot of creaking going on. You can really hear some things shifting around. That's probably all of our cabinets back there. And boy, there's a lot of flex. Each bump, I mean, you can really feel it in the steering wheel too. So a sway bar is going to help combat against all this sway. But another component that I might suggest, steering stabilizer, because that could help mitigate some of this movement we've got in the steering wheel here when we hit our bumps. Now we're in the even bump section, and this is going to simulate going over a speed bump or maybe turn into a driveway. And as long as you're hitting that dead on straight, where both tires hit about the same time, it doesn't really cause much sway. So a sway bar is not going to cause much difference there. The motorhome, you could feel some up and down bouncing, but we didn't have a lot of sway just because of the nature of hitting a speed bump like that. We're going to go into our slalom section next though, and this is where we usually notice a need for a sway bar or not, because this is where we're going to be simulating an evasive maneuver. And if we've got something out there in front of us and we need to be able to get out of the way of it, we want to have the confidence that we could be able to do it and do it safely. And this is where usually things get a little scary on factory motorhomes that don't have any kind of suspension upgrades. So we're going to get into it here, and we're not going to go too fast because yeah, it does got a lot of rocking going on here. We're going to slow it down a little bit just because there was so much rocking. With this thing here, we could have a slight evasive maneuver. That's about as aggressive as I'm going to get with it. It does get a little shaky out there. Even when I was trying to be a little aggressive, it really wanted to throw that weight, and you can get uncomfortable there. So we're going to go ahead and get it back into the shop now and get that sway bar on, and then we'll hit our test course again and see how it compares. So now that we've got our additional Roadmaster sway bar added onto the rear, we're going to go ahead and hit our test course once again. We're going to start with our uneven bump section once again, and when we hit our first bump here, and it's quite a bit less. We do still have a little bit of sway that it did start there, but it's not nearly as drastic as what it was before. We really had a lot of rocking going on before, and now with it still there, we can't eliminate all of it, but we've reduced the amount that we have back and forth movement that we've got going on. I do still think the customer should invest into a steering stabilizer because of all the movement we've got here in the steering wheel. We hit our even bump section here now, and we don't really notice a difference here because we're hitting it straight on. It doesn't really cause any sway if we're hitting it front to back. The sway bar doesn't really affect that in there. If you did have a lot of front and back movement that you were trying to combat, then I would recommend a set of sumo springs. They can help with sway and your forward and back movement. Now we're going to go into our slalom section here, and this is where we're probably going to notice the biggest improvement. So we're going to get a little bit more speed than we had last time, because over that bump section there, I do feel like I've got more confidence in our motorhome just off the bat. But this is really the test. This is kind of the real world application here. We've reduced our sway. We want to try to make our motorhome as safe as possible. And if we've got an event where we need to move, we need to make sure that we can. So we're going to go ahead and get her rocking here. And wow, that is a huge difference. There is still a little bit of pull, but it's not before where it was almost like throwing me and the cameraman back and forth. It's much smoother than it was before. So I'd say it's pretty much a success here. And this is what our sway bar looks like when it's installed. It installs behind our rear axle and is an additional sway bar to help support our factory sway bar, which is located here in front of the rear axle. And while we're looking at them both, you can easily tell that the Roadmaster supplement that we're adding here is a thicker and larger sway bar than our factory one. So this guy here is doing more work than what our old one even used to do. This sway bar will attach on the frame, and the hangers will come down to attach to our sway bar, which is then bolted onto custom brackets that will attach to our axle here. And what this is going to do for us is that whenever our motorhome starts to sway to the left or to the right, for an example, if we had a heavy crosswind and the motorhome swayed to the left, in order for it to sway to the left, the suspension on the right has to extend. And when it goes to extend, it's going to pull up on this bar here, since our frame is attached to it. Likewise, over here on this side, it wants to compress our suspension, and our frame here is going to want to go down closer to our axle, and our bar here wants to push back. It's going to be pushing down on this bar. Our sway bar always wants to return to its natural position here, so this one's going to be pushing back up, the other side's going to be pulling back down to help bring our motorhome back upright. And if it wants to sway back this way, the bar is going to be fighting that because it wants to be straight up. So this is going to help minimize the amount of oscillations you get back and forth when you hit potholes and speed bumps and going over uneven terrain. And it can just overall give you a better handle on your motorhome, because when you have less sway, you can take evasive maneuvers at a higher speed and with greater confidence. So this is going to increase the safety of your motorhome. It's going to minimize how much you're going to have to compensate out there on the road due to sway, giving you more energy. And it's just overall going to increase the quality of your riding experience in your motorhome throughout the life of it as you're out there on your travels. The sway bar is constructed of a 4140 chrome moly steel, and it has a black powder coat finish on it to protect it against rust and corrosion. We'll begin our installation here at the back of the vehicle. There's a couple of bolts we need to remove here, and they're located on the frame just behind the axle here. We can actually get to it through the wheel well. Now, I did lower down our leveling jacks to lift up on the back of our motorhome. We lifted it up all the way to let our rear suspension hang down as low as it'll go. That's going to give us the clearance we need to access those bolts, because if you have it just on the ground, your leaf springs are going to be in the way. We also put a jack stand underneath the frame because we don't want to work on it just supported by our hydraulic jacks. We want to have a solid jack underneath it as well. So here now we're looking through the wheel well. This is the back side of the tire here, and here's our two bolts, and you can see here's our leaf spring. This is why we had to lift it up, so we could clear that. We're going to use a 21 millimeter socket or wrench to remove these bolts. You don't have to put one on the nut on the other side, because there's a small tab on it that actually prevents the nut from spinning, so it'll just thread right out of there. We're going to reuse these bolts and the nuts. Here's the nut here so you can see it. They just usually sit on the frame. Sometimes they'll fall on the ground. But you can see that tab that I was talking about. We can then take our hanger bracket, and we're just going to slide this into position. It's going to line up the holes in our bracket with the holes for the hardware we just removed. So just slide that on through there. Take our other bolt, we're going to line it up, slide it through as well. And then we're just going to thread it right into these nuts on the other side. Once we get it threaded into both of the nuts, we can then tighten down our hardware. Now we've got this one on, we can go ahead and torque the hardware. Once you get both of these brackets on, the one on the other side's the same, and get it all torqued down, we need to move on to installing the plates underneath our U-bolts here. We'll remove the nuts, and the plate's gonna go on bottom. Now, if you've got your vehicle lifted up by the hydraulic jacks while you were putting this one on, your axle here is gonna be hanging down. So if you take these U-bolt nuts loose, it's actually gonna wanna separate from your suspension. So you have a couple of options. You can either put it back on the ground and then remove these nuts, or you could place a jack underneath your axle to hold it up so that way it can't drop down when you take these nuts loose. The option's up to you. We're working on a lift here, and our lift supports it by the wheels, so our vehicle's in a condition that's similar to just being on the ground. To remove these, we are going to be using a 1 1/8 inch socket. These are very big, and they are torqued down pretty tight as well. You can see this is a very large impact we're using here. So you are going to need a very big breaker bar, and prepare to get these off. If the bigger the impact hammer you got, the better. If you're doing it by hand, give yourself plenty of time, because these are going to be tight and it's going to be a struggle. You're also going to make sure that you have a torque wrench that's capable of torquing these back down if you do take them off. You're going to need to exceed 300 foot-pounds in most cases, so make sure you've got a torque wrench that can do so. If you need any of these tools, you can rent them at your local automotive store to be able to complete this job. Now, we did leave two nuts on in opposite corners that'll hold our plate up. I thread one back on that corner before I took the last nut off. This plate is pretty heavy, but the plate needs to stay on there, and then we're going to be adding our new plate here that comes in the kit. This is going to go right on bottom and slide over our U-bolts. The slotted holes are going to go towards the front. We'll remove our nuts, and then we can slide our plate into position and then reinstall our hardware. We want to make sure we get our washers and nuts back on. Now we can go back and tighten down our hardware here. We're going to use our 1 1/8 inch socket again. And we want to try to go back and forth and tighten these down evenly. And also just double check your U-bolts. You always want to make sure that your U-bolts are in the groove on top. We always just double check that as we're going, because if you're using a gun like this, there's a lot of vibrations and it can pop out of its little resting spot up there. We can now go back and torque our hardware to the specifications outlined in our instructions. Just work at it. It will eventually get there. Due to this being U-bolts, they usually take quite a while to get tightened down. Once we get this side fully torqued down, we'll repeat these same procedures over on the other side to get that bracket installed. Make sure that it points towards the inside, just like this one. We can now get our bushings prepared onto our sway bar. These are split bushings, so they open up like that so they can slide on it. And you also get some lubricant in your kit. Now this lubricant here, some customers has reported that they have irritations on their skin from using it. I haven't noticed any myself, but you know your body better than anybody, so just make sure that you're wearing the appropriate gloves if you have sensitive skin. And we want to fully coat the entire inside of our bushing here with our lubricant. Make sure we get it all the way around. And then the little bit of excess that's left on your finger, it's not necessary, but I like to take it and put just a smidge on the outside here like this, and that can just help minimize any squeaks and rattles. Once we've got that lubed up, we can take it and open it up and slap it right onto our sway bar, and then you can put your shackle ends on there as well. We're going to go ahead and get the other side prepared just like this. We can now set our hardware into place. We're going to take the smaller bolts and place a flat washer on it. We're going to drop the bolt down through the rearmost hole, and we're going to do the same thing with the third hole here. We're going to skip one and then drop it into the other one that lines up with it there. We're going to drop our hardware down on the other side as well. It'll just make it a little bit easier when you go to lift your sway bar into position. And now we can go ahead and lift it up. We have washers here that we're going to be placing on the other side. So you want to make sure you've got those handy, and then also make sure you've got all your nuts prepared, because the sway bar is pretty heavy and you may want to consider getting an extra set of hands to help you lift it up there. So now we'll just lift it into place, sliding it over our hardware there. Once we've got it lifted up, place on our flat washer, followed by our nut, and then we'll do the same on the back side. And now with a 17mm socket and a 16mm wrench, we can tighten down our hardware. And then we can torque our hardware to the specifications outlined in our instructions. We can now get our end links into position. We're going to take our end link here. We're going to slide it through our bracket and install it into the lower hole. Our bolt's going to slide from the outside towards the inside of our motorhome, and then we're going to put a nylon locking nut on the other side. We're using the large bolts that come in our kit to attach this. We can then rotate our sway bar up until it's level. So if we go to the lowest hole here, we've actually got a bit of a downward dip. So we're going to go up one more to the next hole, and right here puts us pretty much perfectly parallel with the ground. It is still maybe just a hair down, but that's what we want. We want to have as level of a sway bar as possible. If we were to go up another hole, it'd be too high. So we're gonna go ahead now and then install the bolt on the other side in the same way here, connecting our sway bar to our end link over there. We can now go back and tighten down our bolts. With these ones, we don't want to over tighten them. We really just want to tighten it down until it just starts to compress the bushing. Once we see it start to squeeze it just a little bit, we want to stop. And that's probably good right there. We don't really want to go any tighter because this does need to be able to pivot and rotate. So we're going to do the same thing with the remaining pieces of hardware. Once we have these bolts tightened down, we're now ready to hop in our vehicle and take it for a test drive. You should notice quite a bit of a drastic improvement in your sway, having an additional sway bar in addition to your factory one here. And that completes our installation of Roadmaster's Rear Anti-Sway Bar on our 2016 Ford F-53 chassis motorhome.